Welcome to the Business of Defense. I'm Rich Brady, your host and CEO at the Society of Defense Financial Management. SDFM proudly sponsors this podcast on Federal News Network. SDFM is the premier association of finance and accounting professionals who work in government and business in the defense sector. Our goal is to bring you inside the companies working to drive change in the defense sector, to hear directly from their business leaders, and to understand how they create value for their companies and their customers. And we have a special guest today, and somewhat of a departure from our past shows. We will be talking with the Honorable Kristyn Jones, the former acting Undersecretary of the Air Force and Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller. She left the Air Force this past July. She has had a career spanning the public and private sectors, including positions and ranks held both at the Department of Defense and a Big Four accounting firm. During her most recent time with the Air Force, she helped shape the service's re-optimization for Great Power Competition plan to meet the potential threat posed by near-peer adversaries, particularly China. I'm eager to chat with Kristyn to get her take on defense strategy, defense budgets, and how the department and services can leverage technology and industry to create military capability and advantage. And I think the one thing that we all want to know is, what is she doing next? Kristyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into what you're doing next, I hope you are getting a little bit of rest and relaxation. Let's talk a little bit about your most recent stint with the Air Force as the Undersecretary and the Assistant Secretary for Financial Management and Comptroller.
Sure, happy to. So I was Senate confirmed at the end of April and started at the beginning of May of 2022. Just in time for the national PDI. Yeah. And one of my top priorities within that role was to make sure that we had the FM strategy ready to release basically to the world at the PDI. So we focused first on our people, then our use of our data and systems, especially to get auditable and improve our business processes, and then our use of resources. And that included our budget, our cost and economics team, and our appropriations liaison team as well. So put together the strategy. We were moving out on executing that. I got to see a lot of our great airmen and guardians traveling the world to meet with our FM team. And then early in 24, Secretary Kendall asked if I could step up to be serving as the Undersecretary. So given all of the various complex rules, I was technically still the FM during this time and performing the duties of the Undersecretary. Even though the CFO role for the Air Force and Space Force is incredibly broad, my world got significantly more complicated in that role as we were tackling things like our operational imperatives, making sure that we had the right resourcing strategy. Eventually, recognizing that we needed to focus more on a few key areas in order to re-optimize the Air Force and Space Force to be prepared for great power competition. So those were some of the key areas that I was involved in. But along the way, so many different things from workforce policies to the modernization of the nuclear triad to continuing to make sure that our commissioning programs were headed where they needed to be and everything in between. Yeah, so just so our watchers and listeners understand this, and follow this, you started out in the FM role, got in the seat, everything's running pretty well, and then you're asked to step up to the Undersecretary role, but you still had both jobs simultaneously, and both of them, as you said earlier, full-time jobs. But there's probably some complementary, roles between those two positions, particularly when it comes to the budget and linking the budget to the strategy as well. Did you feel that helped in carrying out both of these roles at the same time? Absolutely, and I do have to give kudos to Carlos Rogers, who stepped up to be performing the duties of the FM and is currently the acting FM. But there is a lot of overlap. Both roles are concerned about optimizing our resources and building the budget, talking to the press, to Congress and others about our resourcing needs and why we put the budget together the way we did. Audit is a key role for both the FM and the Undersecretary, and it was actually great for me to have the broader responsibilities of the Undersecretary because so many of those audit requirements span into non-FM areas. Another key aspect of being the Under that was helpful for both roles was in the business systems, and that was a key aspect of mine. The Air Force really needed to modernize our key business systems, continue to roll out our ERPs, and bring in some of the pay and personnel systems and logistics systems as well. So those were some of the key areas that, having served as the FM and continuing to work on those areas as the under, was particularly helpful.
Yeah, let's dig into those 3 areas a little bit: the optimizing resources, the audit, and the business systems. On the optimizing resources side, they always say there's a difficulty in balancing near-term requirements with long-term modernization. Can you talk about what the Air Force is doing in that area to balance those? Because you really have to do both. And what were some of the pressure points? Inflationary pressures, industrial-based pressures. Where did you run into the biggest challenges in that area?
Absolutely. There were a number of pressures, the Fiscal Responsibility Act being one of them that kept our budgets relatively flat and not keeping up with inflation. Reduced buying power over the last several years from a number of different reasons. Some were COVID impacts on the supply chain and labor. Some were the fact that we were giving great raises to all of our personnel that were higher than that 2.1% projected inflation. A lot of concerns about the actual delivery of our programs on cost and schedule, given some of those pressures as well. And for both the Air Force and Space Force, I believe there was a widespread recognition that those capabilities are so critical to any future fight, particularly in the Indo-Pacific area, because of the speed and the range that's necessary. So trying to make sure that we were moving in the right direction from our modernization programs, but also having to think about our readiness, our tech debt, taking care of people. So there were a lot of things that we were trying to fit in to a relatively flat budget. And so that made some difficult choices in terms of what we could afford and what we couldn't afford in the 24 and 25 budgets.
Shifting to audit a little bit, which ultimately supports military readiness. If you've got better visibility of all of your assets, not just financial, and it's audit ready, you realistically can make better decisions from it. Where is the Air Force, in your view, kind of on its audit path?
I think the Air Force has made a lot of progress over the last couple of years. It's challenging when you're trying to improve the data, improve the business systems, all of the underlying processes, and that requires coordination across the entire enterprise, not just FM. And I want to give kudos to the Marine Corps for the level of leadership engagement that I saw that I think sets the standard for everybody else. But the Air Force was able to address some key material weaknesses. The funds balance with Treasury was one that happened on my watch, and I'm hoping that when I see the financial statements for the end of this year, that the military equipment material weakness was also addressed this year. Another key lesson learned from the Marine Corps was how you can get after an audit that is more substantive based. The rest of the Department of Defense is focusing on our controls. We're so big that we need to have those controls in place to be able to get through an audit. But the smaller services, like the Marine Corps and the Space Force, can go about it in a different way. And I'm hoping to see, again, a lot of plans in place that the Space Force will be the next service that's auditable, maybe as soon as next year.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we've been talking a lot about the Air Force here, but you had a dual mandate. You're responsible for the Space Force as well in all of this, certainly smaller than the Air Force, but no less impactful given everything that's going on in space and contested space environment now.
Absolutely, and the Space Force has taken on some missions that were being performed by others, by the Space Development Agency, which came into the Air Force, by the Army and other services. But I think what everyone across the Joint Force has recognized is that space is a contested domain, and we need capabilities that haven't ever been in anyone's budget in the past. And so that does require an increase in the funding that's available to the Space Force. And again, I'm hoping that with 25 and 26, we'll start to see that continue to move up after having a little bit of a flat line in 24.
And the final area that you talked about was business systems. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do we need to do, or what do the services need to do to optimize their business? Because we have a lot of antiquated systems. Some are necessary, but consolidation, if you want to make them audit ready, you're going to need probably replacements. So what's the path to that, to improving overall business systems and making them auditable?
Defense business systems has been a passion of mine for a couple decades since I worked earlier at the Business Transformation Agency. And as I mentioned with the audit, there's no way that the larger services will get to auditability without improving our business systems. The end-to-end processes, the data, the controls are so reliant on having those business systems modernized and in the state that they should be. So for the Air Force, I was a little surprised to see that there was still a ways to go in rolling out the core accounting system, DEEMS, to the entire Air Force. So that was a significant focus of mine, to have a roadmap that we could get off the legacy system gaffes and roll out DEEMS to the entire enterprise, and that's moving along well. Also, the pay and personnel systems, AFIPS is the name of the Air Force system, making sure that we had a good path for limited deployments and then a full deployment. It's a hard one. A lot of the services are struggling with their pay systems, but the Air Force has a good plan, and I just hope to see that they continue to execute against that plan. And then finally, on the logistics system side, it's been a long path toward this, but MROI is now live at its first location. There's still a lot to do for it to have all of the capabilities that it needs, and to be able to support the entire enterprise of the Air Force, but to finally have that maintenance, repair, and overhaul system in place at least at one location was a significant win.
You are listening to The Business of Defense with my guest, Kristyn Jones, former Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force and Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Business of Defense, sponsored by the Society of Defense Financial Management on Federal News Network. I'm talking with Kristyn Jones, former Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force and Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller. Kristyn's dedication to public service spans over 30 years and led to some of the highest levels of leadership within the Air Force. With a diverse military, government, corporate, and political appointee background, she has charted a career path that is as much a tribute to her hard work and dedication as it is to her reputation and expertise. She no doubt has some lessons learned and inspiring stories for those who aspire to follow in her path. So Kristyn, if we could talk a little bit about your path to this position. You started out, I understand, at West Point and did some time in the military. If we could kind of start there and kind of chart your path to what led to this position, these positions in the Air Force.
Sure. I was lucky enough to start my career in Germany as a military intelligence officer. It's where I met my husband, also a military intelligence officer. So we served together in the Army for a while. I actually had an injury that I'd had as a cadet get worse while I was on active duty, so that's ultimately what led to the decision for me to leave. But I still was serving as a military spouse and following my husband's career around while I was also trying to establish my own after the military. I ended up going back to school to get my MBA in finance and worked for a couple Fortune 500 companies, the first one in the DC area and the second one after we moved to the Austin and Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos area. Had my first child while we were in that area, and we were moving back to the DC area for my husband's career when 9/11 happened. And it was at that time that I said, I think I need to go back into government. So my first role in that regard was at the Office of Naval Research, where I served for a couple of years managing the science and technology budget for the Navy, and then had the opportunity to move to what became the Business Transformation Agency. I was there for a number of very exciting years and learned a lot, but eventually thought that I might want to go back to do something else, and was lucky enough to go into the Cost and Economics organization at the Army and eventually become a senior executive. I served as a senior executive in the Army until 2014. And as I thought about what I wanted to do next, I wanted to be able to apply what I'd learned throughout my career in a number of different areas. And so I decided that consulting would be a good fit for that point. I went to work for KPMG and served a number of different federal clients until my old boss from the Army, Bob Spear, asked me about coming back to government. And I thought about that and said, for the right situation, I would be willing to do that. And that right situation meant having control of a budget, being responsible for an organization, and being part of an organization that was wanting to transform. And I certainly got that with the opportunities that I received at the Air Force and Space Force.
So having this really a broad mix of both public sector and private sector experience, do you think it gave you a unique perspective being in your positions with the Air Force, where you could really match up the requirements that were being generated by the government side with the capabilities you knew were out there in the private sector?
I do think that that blend of having the military experience, the Fortune 500 and consulting experience, and then the senior government level responsibilities was unique and was helpful for me in navigating that. Even things like my initial military intelligence lessons learned were helpful as I dealt with the Space Force, which has many, many SAP programs. Right. And so understanding some of the things that I had learned previously was helpful to bring into that environment. So one of the things that I learned in industry was what was really the state of the art, what was happening in the commercial sector that we needed to bring into defense in terms of data and analytics capabilities, as an example. I also learned a lot about how business gets done, how companies make money. And so that was important in understanding how to think about the modernization programs for the Air and Space Force and how to consider risk in those large programs. Having seen it on the other side, it was helpful to bring in that perspective.
Now, a lot of companies talk about the valley of death, the difficulty of developing a technology and then finally getting it into a program of record. And there's some successful programs out there. They talk about SBIR, mid-tier acquisitions, OTAs, authority, those type of things. What's the future of that? Do you think that the department and the services are making enough progress in this area to harness all of that innovative thought that's happening out there in the private sector and get it into programs in a timely manner?
Making progress, yes. Making enough progress, no, I don't think so. I really do think that if we're going to be competitive, we have to expand the defense industrial base. So I'm excited to see all of the energy that's being applied in this defense area, the focus from OSD and the services and the combatant commands to do that. But I do think it's still too challenging. And also, I think one key thing is that folks need to know what are the requirements from the warfighters and the services. What the warfighters are driving are the things that we need now. So the ability to get commercial applications that meet security requirements for the DoD at scale and immediate, I think it is a key focus. And that's where some of the efforts that you mentioned can help us. But then long term, as we think about shipbuilding or the cost of the next generation platform for the Air Force or future satellites or things like that, we really have to tap into the innovation of the defense industrial base and look at how we can move quickly, how we can leverage their capabilities, how we can reduce costs. There's a lot of activity in that space as well. And so I think the more we can make it easy to prototype, to experiment, to learn from our early efforts, and then continue to move forward. One great example of that was the Collaborative Combat Aircraft program that the Air Force has. And I think that can be a model for other efforts in the future for how we can bring in new entrants into the industrial base and really look at scaling them to meet some of our toughest challenges.
So it sounds like it's not just a money issue. You can't necessarily throw more money at this problem and it's going to solve it. There are policies that need to be in place. There's a workforce aspect of it. There's service organizational culture also. Where do you think that the services and the department can make the most impact across those areas?
Well, I think one thing that we need to get smarter about is how we do our contracting. Because even if the funding is there, we need to be more flexible in how we bring in our entrants, how we write requirements, how we evaluate those requirements. So I think that there is still some work to do there. But one of the things that I've seen a lot of progress in is considering open system architectures, not getting locked in to one vendor who provides your entire tech stack, but being able to add new entrants, even allies and partners, into the mix and be able to swap out as new capabilities are introduced and available. So I think the more that we can do that, the better, but it does require that the government take on more of a role as the systems integrator, and that's not something that we have a lot of experience doing. So I think training in those kinds of areas as well is really important.
So I know we've got a lot of small business watchers and listeners, so what role do you see small business playing in this? They'll come and tell us, hey, we've got these great ideas and everything, but it's very difficult to compete with the bigs. It's very costly for us. Are there opportunities to engage the small to mid-sized business better to improve these efforts?
Absolutely. There's so much interest in this area right now. I think understanding what is the direction that defense is going, not just that you have the capability to build a widget, but that's a widget that solves a critical defense need. That's really important. I think also understanding how to differentiate. As an example, I was recently spending some time with some startups, and there's a huge swirl of activity in areas like AI and autonomy. And so what differentiates that small business from others? I think also building relationships with the primes is important as you're first starting out, because that gives you an opportunity to get into programs of record, get a revenue stream, and then eventually build, and maybe you can be the prime at some point in the future. But I think knowing how to leverage the rest of the defense industrial base and figure out where you can add the most value is key to being able to go from I've got a great idea to I'm eventually a defense prime.
Now, earlier you mentioned kind of getting back to your path to these positions, a mentor that you had, Bob Spear. Are there other mentors along the way that helped you out, and what kind of advice did they give you?
So back in my business transformation agency days, Tom Modley was another one that really helped me out. In fact, the Army SES role that I eventually got, he was the one that suggested I go back to my Army roots. One of the things that I believe Tom said in the past that I still reference a lot today is that leadership is a verb. That it's not about your title, your power, those kinds of things. It's really about the responsibility for leading others and for developing them, setting expectations, helping them to deliver to the best of their capabilities and building trust among your team. So that's one of the things that I would credit Tom from back a number of years ago.
One of the other areas that we talk a lot about, and that's women advancing national security. I think at one point in time, just a few years back, 4 of the top 5 defense contractors were led by women, and I think you're a testament that there are opportunities. There is a pathway. But did you find for yourself that was a difficult path, or were there plenty of opportunities if you put yourself out there? What advice would you have for the young women entering the workforce who, again, want to aspire to one of these positions?
It's a very different world than when I went to West Point, and it was 10% of my class. We graduated exactly 100 women. Very different now. And as I sat in some of the senior level Defense Department meetings, like the DMAGs and the DWCs, with the Deputy Secretary at the chair and half the seats in the room filled by women, we've come a long way. I think we need to figure out how to help women, particularly in those kind of mid-career areas where they're trying to raise families and they're trying to figure out, can I do it all? And helping to have flexibility, helping to have mentors who've gone through that. The more role models we have at the most senior levels, I think can help. And then, of course, our policies that are child-friendly, that help with diversity, that help make sure that our educational opportunities are fair and equitable to all. I think those are some of the things that can help women who want to succeed in these senior positions to be able to get there.
Great. Well, I think we're at the point where we have to ask the question that everybody wants to know, and that is, what are you doing next?
So I've started some part-time consulting work as a senior advisor with McKinsey. I'm also looking to our conversation earlier about how I can help with some of these key issues with expanding the defense industrial base, whether that's with startup companies themselves, venture capital, or later stage into private equity and those kinds of things. I've spent a lot of time with the defense budget, defense acquisition, looking at risk. And so I'm hoping that I can take some of that background to help companies who are trying to navigate that road so that we can bring in a broader set of capabilities and improve our national security.
Well, great. We can't wait to see what impact that you continue to have on our national security. And thank you very much for your service to the Air Force and the United States.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank today's guest, Kristyn Jones, former Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force and Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller, for her insights on the latest transformation efforts taking place in the Air Force and the Department of Defense, and how government and industry can work together to solve some of our most complex national security challenges. Visit sdfm.org to learn more about our Defense Financial Management community and register for the upcoming Data Analytics and Decision Support virtual conference happening Thursday, October 24th, where we'll dive into how data innovation and AI empowerment can impact next generation auditability. Watch The Business of Defense next month, where we bridge the gap between the boardroom and the battlefield to advance the mission of national security. I'm Rich Brady, CEO of the Society of Defense Financial Management. You are listening to the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search SDFM. Thank you.